You are listening to the Law Enforcement Pirate Radio Network. Radio Free Larry presiding.
You can run, but you can't hide.
Radio Free Larry.
All right, here we go again. And here we go again. Here we go again with the Law Enforcement Pirate Radio Network, Radio Free Larry. And here we go again with it doesn't even feel comfortable calling it impeachment with the criminal conspiracies, attacks on democracy, freedom, liberty, the republic. They are a criminal conspiracy. They are the deep state shadow government criminal enterprise, formerly known, as I coined the first terminology, as being Federico. You can talk about deep state all you like, but if all you're speaking about is the attack on the president, then you're not speaking about the deep state. You're speaking about one cell, and that one cell's one overt act, or I guess several overt acts. However, one cell's partial activity, not the totality of that cell's activity. Again, there are deep state people within the narrative for the president that are actually hindering the president by not allowing the narrative to move forward to include all of the deep state shadow government criminal enterprise activity. Fox News, I won't name the broadcaster. He's well known, but he said that the impeachment hearings don't affect the everyday person. Not really. True. It affects the everyday person, and I'm sure he believes that in a protracted sense. But there are tens of thousands of deep state shadow criminal enterprise cells throughout the United States watching the impeachment hearing. It doesn't matter if they even impeach the president. They want that to happen, and by a simple majority, they might criminally and corruptly engage in such criminal conspiracy and impeach the president without any real facts of crime or behavior that is impeachable. And I don't even want to say it that way. There's no reason to be looking at the president as they are. It's a form of extortion, a form of racketeering, and they are engaged in it as they have been engaged in it. So there's these cells, tens of thousands of cells that are looking at the president being made uncomfortable and harassed day in and day out. They are criminal enterprise. It's the same thing that any other criminal enterprise would do. I'm speaking with my hands and I just hit the microphone stand. So let me move my hands to my authoritarian position on my hips, and maybe that'll work better. They want the president to be made uncomfortable. They do this all the time. Criminal enterprises and criminals will attack the people that know about their crime that they do not trust, as far as keeping that crime going and keeping that crime concealed. The president is revealing and has a desire to reveal those crimes when and where he needs to. That means this: there is no necessity to prosecute the Bidens. However, obviously the Justice Department could. Which means this: he has a life of service, and I've said this before, at a certain point, we might just move that away and say, now we have a better handle, we have more knowledge on what is going on in these deep state enrichment schemes. And of course, some would say some of it is extortion. Again, they're trying to hurl that at the president using psychological projection. They've done this their whole life. But because they were in that deep state shadow government criminal enterprise, criminal conspiracy, they were powered to say anything and have it stick, at least in a sense of ruining a life. And then they go, well, we didn't prosecute that person, but you ruined that person's life and you're still doing it. And I'm not the only one that's a victim. So again, the reality is these are narcissists that have psychological warfare capabilities, psychological torture capabilities, and they're being protected by criminals in government. And it could be your governor, it could be your mayor, it could be your police chief, it could be a lieutenant, a sergeant, it could be an IRS person, it could be a billionaire like Soros, it could be a millionaire like Ballas or multimillionaire like Ballas Enterprises out of Texas, operating in New Mexico, owning the people with their money and their coercion. They are extortionists. They are in racketeering. Most likely the father was a cocaine cowboy in Texas in the 80s, and that's how he made his money and then converted it into real estate. He's protected by the FBI today. He's protected by DHS today. Because why? Because that's who they are. Don't let them tell you that measly little cases that they're working have anything to do with protecting this nation. It's providing a cover for their criminal enterprise. John Gotti is actually a better person than the FBI and the CIA today. And there's no doubt. And that's been true for over 20 years now. Now, there are good people in there, but they're not going to protect you from that type of thing. They can't, because they were never the person that they say and represent themselves as. I'm glad we had a military person go before the public, and God did that. Because I've been speaking about these psychological warfare experts in the FBI that had operated in Iraq and Afghanistan and are now part of the communist cells destroying our citizenry today. They might help you. Remember, Nazi Germany, communist Soviet Union, and China arrest criminals. So just because they're in a position that they haven't been allowed to keep because they're corrupt doesn't mean that they're not engaged in the overall criminal scheme that I've been explaining for over 10 years now, openly online. However, I've also been explaining it in the community to people that were interested in knowing. And nothing really in depth. I entered into oral discussion in the air. And I don't know if you know that works. You speak out loud, God hears, the spirits hear, the existence hears, and things can change just by merely speaking. That's why they don't even want you to think it or speak it, because things do affect how they are viewed. But it takes time, because corruption and criminal behavior has been in government before I even enter into government. So therefore, it just built upon itself. So we need to be in a deconstruction phase of that, where it can't build upon itself. So go back to the idea that the Bidens never needed to be prosecuted. They're making it necessary to be prosecuted, because what they're doing is showing a larger criminal conspiracy than was initially seen. It's almost like an investigative technique that Schiff is using to investigate Biden, but he's not, of course. And I believe he didn't want Biden to be elected anyway. He wants Elizabeth Warren or somebody else in there. So that's part of what the Democratic Party does to one another. It's part of what the deep state does to one another. They're constantly jockeying for power. One of the guys that was part of a certain group of people within my workplace was supportive of the bosses until it became time for him to come into his own. And of course, it also involved his connections with CIA, whether they were covert, shadow, or overt. It involved his connections with CIA criminal enterprise, whether they were overt connections, covert connections, or shadow communicated connections. The CIA used its technology to take over the United States and empower people that it knew was corrupt. If they weren't corrupt or knew were corrupt, if they weren't corrupt, they wouldn't have gotten there. They just wouldn't be there. It just wouldn't happen. Because they're using that psychological analysis and reality to figure out if they could ever turn you into a criminal. And if they can't, you become a Robin Gritz. You become a Bob Levinson. Disappearing government people is known. You become a Bill Scott. See, Matt Fogg is always basing it in race-related terms, and that's not all it was or is, and really what it isn't, because it takes a larger thing for it to work. Otherwise, somebody would stop it. That's where they go with it to motivate and manipulate people using the psychology of torture, and how they recruit people to torture and to harm their fellow citizen, fellow coworker, whatever it may be. So again, the Bible tells us not to seek our own in charity. So in our work, we don't usually find people that don't seek their own. They have a little niche, and that's where they are, and they focus on that. And of course, the deep state tells them, good, now you're okay. When I was back in the academy, I brought up the fact that some people were auditors before they were investigators, and they were told to stop an audit. Obviously, it was a political reasoning that somebody needed to be not audited, and it was a basic audit. Again, two similar activities are not the same unless they're the same. If you're doing a deep state audit of somebody because you're a deep state person, you're obviously not auditing for legitimate reasons. This entity was being audited for legitimate reasons. And they were told, cease and desist. So we see this in the deep state shadow government criminal enterprise also, that people will be investigated for extortion and racketeering. They want to say harassment. That harassment is such a small word, it doesn't even begin to color what they're doing. It takes about 15 criminal charges to begin to describe what's going on, and those are major charges such as RICO, deprivation of rights under color of law, protected activity rights violation, suborning perjury, false statements. It goes on and on. Defrauding the United States is a daily activity for these people. So what's going on within voter fraud? What's going on within voter fraud is that it's not being investigated. Any investigator that's worth their salt knows the difference between an audit and an investigation. It's not being investigated. Maybe 1 in a million, but the majority of what's going on within voter fraud is actually audit. They're just auditing the records. That's not an investigation. An auditor is not an investigator. An investigator that's engaged in an audit that has no intention of investigating or causing investigation is not investigating, they're auditing. That's a very different activity. That's why you're not coming up with any results. Because we have people within the system of elections that are part of the criminal enterprise. Therefore, you're not going to see it. They're there to cover it, and they cover it. And law enforcement has fallen in many circles. We don't want to confuse two things. Supporting the thin blue line is not supporting corruption. We are not going to say that if we don't support corruption within law enforcement, that we're somehow hindering the thin blue line. That is what was started probably about 20 years ago or so to cover over the deep state shadow government criminal enterprise. They wanted to say if you said anything about law enforcement, then you were actually anti-law enforcement. Well, that's insane. We can't get anywhere with that. And you didn't get anywhere with that. I told you that this was going to happen. I said, if you didn't respect the rights of your coworkers and the rights of the public, and I'm not speaking about the cases where people are getting $10 million for something stupid because they happen to be a liberal heroin dealer. and they're connected to the mayor or the governor or some police officer some way. So again, you see how it's all twisted by them. And when I'm speaking, I'm untwisting it. I'm waking you up. So again, we are free to think. And I'm going to go into the awoke thought. They stole something I was speaking about for many years, since at least 2005, the awakening. The awakening is something treasured, something holy, something real. Doesn't have to be religious, but is brought about by deeply spiritual people. Many of them are religious, and it's a healing. And I was explaining that for years, and all of a sudden they came up with this awoke status. Awoke is not awakened. It's a scam to defraud being awakened. You understand that. Satan brought it along, but the deep state, shadow government, criminal enterprise is using that as a psychological warfare technique against the concept of awakening, because their big fear is that you realize that they're not living the same life you are and you're not living the same life they are, because they put you to sleep, because they're devils, demons, antichrist, witches, and sorcerers, even if they're your preacher owning your mind for criminal enterprise, hate, and the devil. That's really what's going on. And it doesn't mean that they're LGBTQ, and it doesn't mean that they're not LGBTQ, because these are the things that the accuser uses, and the accuser being Satan, to confuse you. So again, awaken to something very, very treasured. I'll probably be moving on an awakening movement again, where I am healing the awakening to see if it can get anywhere. Now, what does that mean? God says, okay, give it a try again, because you've engaged in several awakening movements, and the deep state, shadow government, criminal enterprise killed it and are now psychologically operating around it to make people be less likely to speak about being awakened, because now they have the awoke term. So you're going to shy away from the woke term because or the awakened term, because it sounds like awoke. So again, knowledge is power, and they don't want people to know that they don't even think about getting things in life. They're just given. They don't work hard. Most of them are scammers. Even if they spend a lot of hours doing something, it's to be the hero that they're not, which means they're a deep state, shadow government, criminal enterprise, propaganda, a genocidal hero. That's who they are. That, just tell yourself that's the majority of what's going on in government. There's a few good people here, a few good people there, but of course, none good. No, not one. So the reality is, we're stuck in something that we were put into by people that have knowledge about awakening and being awakened. I bring up my partner's name and say he walked over to me one day and said something, I think, about the inner voice. But he looked at me like real resolute. And I don't know if he was hearing me in his head speaking about such things, or even asking him to see if I was awakened, or something was asking. But he was trying to see if I was awakened. And I was asleep. And I don't know what I said. I can't even remember, but, maybe I just chuckled, like trying to do something. And he's talking to me. He's like, what are you talking about? I think he's being silly, but it's real. There's an inner voice, and there's things. I speak the voice mostly because they're blocking my mind from hearing my inner voice. I can hear it, but when I hear it, it's got so much of the deep state in there, the FBI and CIA and Homeland Security, and they're going, like devils, demons, antichrist, witches, sorcerers that they are, trying to possess my mind. So it has to be blocked. And then I use a different pathway to speak my inner mind, or speak what's coming into my inner mind. It's kind of an oracle. So again, now you know what oracles are and what they're used for, because I'm pretty much the only person on earth that really tells you what it is. But you see that title places, or oracle over here. You see awakened, awakening. So they're not speaking to you about what it means. And if you don't have that knowledge, it just kind of bounces off your brain and goes a different direction. So I've been enlightening and awakening people for a long time. Most of your religious pursuits to say they enlighten and awaken are very limited, and they use ancient technologies that, quite frankly, leave you out of what's really going on. And that's okay, because the CIA approved of those people, and many of them will work for the CIA to harm their neighbor and take over the United States for criminal enterprise, and that includes local and state governments also. When I say CIA, when I say FBI, it encompasses their entire deep state, shadow government, criminal enterprise. But we have to use their names so you know who the major players are in this thing, and who's allowing it to exist, and who's propagating it. Again, they'll investigate somebody for extortionate purposes, attempting to make that person a criminal for their criminal enterprise. If they can't, then they'll use additional psychological warfare, including surreptitious drugging, extreme surreptitious drugging, because I believe some people were drugged into the deep state shadow government enterprise. Again, it sounds a lot like a cult, and it is a cult. It is a cult. So the deep state shadow government criminal enterprise is a cult that is causing crime to exist, either for its purposes or to destroy another person using psychological methods that are documented. The documentation is very limited because they're not going to document their manipulation all that much, and much of it is top secret still. However, you can look at MK Ultra. Now, MK Ultra, when you look at the documentation, it only speaks about so much of it. The Bible's the same way. It only speaks to so much of the activity because it's known what they're doing to manipulate the person. It's not only, hey, I give you LSD and you're going to run off and do something by the nature of LSD. I mean, you could, but yet there is a whole psychological warfare program. By the time Wayne Ritchie received that dose of LSD from the CIA officer, he was already operated. No CIA officer is going to call him a nitwit unless he's been working some psychological manipulation for some time. And that includes a ton of people in his community that are working for the CIA to do that to him. So again, this idea that Matt Fogg sees it in mostly, if not completely in racial terms, is kind of why they let him live, maybe. Because he's people are going to go, because everybody knows they also do it to Caucasians, and they also do it to Latinos, and they also do it to Asian people. They do it to whoever they want to do it to because the devil tells them who to do it to. It's that simple. If they call the devil Jesus, it doesn't make the devil Jesus. But on this planet, I will tell you, people call out to Jesus while speaking to the devil. And that devil has been named Jesus by those people. And I've told you before, there are those that call out to Allah, and Allah is Satan. But the term Allah is God, and there are people that call out to God using the term Allah. It's just an Arabic term for God, the same as Yah. Now, if we were in, I hit the microphone there, let me get my arms at my sides here. If we were in Arabia a long time ago, we would, before Islam, we would hear people say the term Allah in reference to Yah, as far as speaking about that religion. They wouldn't necessarily call God Yah or El Shaddai. If they were Arabic, they would say Allah in reference to the Jews, in reference to Christianity, if they were good people. So you understand how that happens. So again, it's all in the heart more than it's anywhere else, and the Bible tells you that in depth. But yet we see people constantly saying the heart doesn't matter, and the proof is in the pudding. Well, what pudding? You see the pudding? Well, you can see pudding, but you can't see the heart. So you can't see the heart of the matter, you can't see the matter. But you believe you can. And the Bible tricked you into exposing yourselves. Because you can't see it. You don't know what it is. You can encourage your friend to do something, but that's a very intricate art, and Paul spoke about it. Because if you take all of Paul's teachings together, they make sense. If you just take it isolated, then it makes no sense. You know, each piece not fitting together in the whole doesn't work. And again, when you take Paul, you have to take Paul in context to what Jesus didn't say. Would Jesus be against prisons? Yes. Would Jesus be against executions? Yes. But where are we today? We're way past that simple problem-solving answer or problem-solving equation. Yes, Jesus can help, but yet when the church is owned, Jesus is very limited in what he can do, again, being the synagogue of Satan. If you're owned in a church to do what the CIA and the FBI tells you, and I'm not telling you to commit crimes, I'm not telling you to let crimes exist, But you have an obligation to Jesus before you have an obligation to your FBI deep state boss and your CIA deep state boss. For all we know, they wanted terrorism. And we know to a certain degree they did because they used it for their own benefit financially, politically, and as far as exerting extortionate power over people. So again, Satan is very deceptive. But Satan will always be accusing people. You'll always see that. And most of those accusations are meritless and have no basis in reality. But we're to the point where they have CIA moving psychological warfare technique, spycraft technique, causing action, and then pointing at the action, whether it be criminal or not. That is not legal at all. In fact, if the CIA and FBI move psychological warfare, psychological manipulation at the level of CIA, cult-like manipulation, and somebody offends, that case is not usable, number one. Number two, that person is owed money. And this has happened over and over and over again. I've never done it. I've never seen it done while I was in the government with knowledge of what it was. It took them doing it to me for a long time and me being able to investigate it with God's help to figure out what it was and what they were doing. But then I could go back and say, oh, that's what they were doing there. That's what they were doing there. And of course, that's why they put Robin Gritz out. He was figuring it out. They weren't working to get Bob Levinson out. They were actually working against the possibility of Bob Levinson being released. Bob was disappeared, no doubt. The only question is who, what, where, and why. Well, praise God in all that you do. Praise God.
You are listening to the Law Enforcement Pirate Radio Network. Radio Free Larry presiding.
You can run, but you can hide.
Radio Free